My name is Dr. Jim Reinhardt, and I'm a professor of international relations here at Troy University. I'm also the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and I am joined today by three folks I'd like to take a moment to introduce because we truly are blessed with their backgrounds. And I'm going to introduce them in the order of their presentations. And this is designed to be this way. I'll get into that in just a second. Dr. Margaret Nowinska, to my far left, is an assistant professor of history at Troy University. She received her PhD from the George Washington University in January 2010. Her dissertation is entitled Poland and the Cold War in East and Southeast Asia, 1949 to 1965. She has an MA in International Affairs from the Elliott School of International Affairs and a BA in International Politics and Economics from Middlebury College up in Vermont. She is a Fulbright scholar, and she's a Boren Fellow, which sounds interesting when you say that real fast. It sounds like a boring fellow. David Boren is a former U.S. Senator from Oklahoma and now president of the University of Oklahoma, and has established the fellowships which she was part of. She's published as well as presented her research in the United States and around the world. Dr. Nowinska has been working closely over the years with the Cold War International History Project of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. by translating archival documents and partaking in international workshops and conferences organized by that organization. She's traveled extensively throughout East and Southeast Asia, including Japan, China, Korea, and Vietnam, for both research and pleasure. She's also spent much time traveling in Europe, especially Eastern Europe and in Russia. She speaks Polish, Russian, Japanese, and Spanish. She is currently working on revising her dissertation into two books, one on Poland's peacekeeping efforts during the Vietnam War, and another on Sino-Polish relations during the Cold War, with a specific focus on the role of the Sino-Soviet split and the U.S.-China opening. Dr. Nowinska will be focusing her comments today, and she will go first for a good reason. She'll be focusing on sort of the backdrop here, the context. We can't study anything in history or in international relations without providing an appropriate context, and that's her role today. The history of the Cold War is a complex one, and it's not completely been written as yet. We don't know what the final answers are, but she will be providing that because what we're dealing with, the topic at hand here, is very much related to Cold War activities over the past half century. Dr. Jamie Todhunter is an assistant professor of political science here at Troy University. His research focuses on how domestic politics influences conflict and conflict resolution processes. His work has been published in International Negotiation, and which is a journal, and he is currently working on several projects related to the intersection of U.S. domestic politics and conflict resolution. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Tennessee. Dr. Todhunter will be focusing today on the American perspective of these issues, which is quite interesting. Should we even have a perspective on these issues? I believe they should, but there are a lot of Americans who probably don't. And he will be providing a U.S. Look at these events. On my right is Dr. Michael Slobodchikoff. Michael has published two books on Russian relations with post-Soviet states. His first book was Strategic Cooperation, Overcoming the Barriers of Global Anarchy, which was published in 2013. His current book, entitled Building Hegemonic Order, Russia's Way, let me say that again, Building Hegemonic Order, Russia's Way, Rules, Stability, and Predictability in the Post-Soviet Space, is currently in press and about to come out. He's also published peer-reviewed articles in the Journal of International Relations and Development, the International Area Studies Review, the Journal on Ethnic Politics and Minority Issues in Europe, and Studies of Changing Societies. He is also the editor of the Russian, Eurasian, and Eastern European book series through Lexington Books. Dr. Slobodchikoff specializes in relations between Russia and the former Soviet states, international conflict and peace, and comparative politics. He is a regular contributor to Russia Direct, the Russian International Affairs Council, and has often served as an analyst on Russian relations with Ukraine for BBC World News. He has also served as an analyst on Russian relations with the United States for Voice of Russia Radio. His role today is to provide us with the Russian perspective of these events. So I think we have a wonderful package, and each of our discussants will be talking for about 15 to 20 minutes. Once we get that done, we're going to open it up to you and allow you to respond to their comments in any candid and civil way that you choose. So let's get started. Dr. Doinska.
Yes. Can everyone hear me? Excellent, because I cannot hear myself. I kind of can, but this is the first time I'm actually wearing this kind of piece, so it's very exciting. Thank you, Dr. Reinhardt, for this very kind introduction, and I would like to thank Michael for putting this panel together, and I would like to thank Jamie for participating, and especially Dr. Reinhardt for moderating this panel and taking the time out of his very busy schedule. And I'm very pleased to see that it's a very interdisciplinary panel, because I'm a historian, we have political scientists, and this dialogue does not happen as often as it probably should. So I'm here to provide, as Dr. Reinhardt mentioned, some context, but I'm also here to offer my 2 cents to this very controversial and very difficult international, or what could be an international incident. The origins of the Cold War, as some of you know, some of you may not know, began in the mid-1940s after World War II, and they're still debated. They're still debated to this day, but overall, after 70 years or so, scholars agree, and they really are coming to a consensus finally, that the Soviet Union and the United States engaged in an almost half a century of competition that was caused by misperceptions of each other's actions and policies, and that we'll be talking about misperceptions here in this panel. The Cold War was an intense political, military, economic, and cultural rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers, for influence in the world. These two countries, the United States and the Soviet Union, offered two competing visions of modernity. One of them, the United States, offered the idea of modernity based on capitalist democracy. The Soviet Union offered the idea of modernity based on communism. What made this competition extremely dangerous was the presence of nuclear weapons and thermonuclear weapons. And in fact, this prospect of global thermonuclear war made this superpower competition extremely dangerous, and at times it really put the world on the brink of a nuclear war, and it was none other than the Cuban Missile Crisis, very close to the United States. What is really important for us to understand is that the United States and the Soviet Union never went into a direct conflict with each other. They never engaged in a direct conflict with each other, and hence the Cold War. However, they competed all around the world through proxy wars in Vietnam, the Vietnam War, in Korea, in the Korean War, and that also drew regional powers like China and also like Japan into those conflicts. The Americans and the Soviets also competed very feverishly in Latin America and also in the Middle East by engaging in covert operations, toppling governments, sometimes very popularly elected governments. So that competition was also through other proxy kind of powers. And starting especially in the 1950s and going all the way into the 1980s, toward the end of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a highly dangerous, you can argue, competition over the hearts and minds of Africans who were in the process of decolonization and who were shopping, you can argue, for their ways of modernity. Some were trying to figure out, do we want to go with a communist system? Some would try to figure out, do we go with capitalist democracy? Most of all, however, as global as the Cold War was, most of all, however, the Cold War, the major battleground of the Cold War, remained in Europe. This is where the Cold War started after the defeat of Germany. This is where Europe was divided and remained divided, and this is exactly where it ended. All throughout the Cold War, as some of you are aware, Europe was divided along the Iron Curtain between two competing military alliances. One of them was NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, allied with the United States and Canada, and the other one with the Warsaw Pact. So the Soviet bloc nations belonged to the Warsaw Pact. And Germany, of all the nations in Europe, was divided, and so was Berlin. And Berlin really became this iconic symbol of the Cold War, as the city was divided by the Berlin Wall. So it really served as this iconic symbol of the Cold War. Now, in 1989, this deadly competition that never really blew out came to an end. And it really came to an end, and it came remarkably to an end without much bloodshed. It was very much kind of peaceful. And scholars to this day argue, they debate, they write books, they write articles and say, what is this that brought this incredible conflict that had so much influence all around the world to an end? And there are many competing schools of thought. One school of thought would tell you that it's all thanks to the Soviet leader, Mr. Mikhail Gorbachev, who was solely responsible for bringing the end to the Cold War. Some of them would tell you it is all because of Ronald Reagan, of President Ronald Reagan, who was a grand strategist and he knew exactly how to defeat the Soviet Union. He had a plan. Well, some would tell you not exactly. There were some non-state actors like Solidarity movement in Poland that challenged not just the Soviet rule, but the communist rule in general. Some would tell you, wait a second, maybe it's also the role of religion. Maybe Pope John Paul II had something to do with bringing down the Cold War. The most recent scholarship, which I find fascinating because it is based on the most recent available both American documents and former Russian documents, argues that it was actually 4 leaders. It was Mikhail Gorbachev, it was President Ronald Reagan, it was George Shultz, and it was George H.W. Bush. Why? Because these leaders understood that they needed to engage with each other. So in other words, they had to engage with an adversary in order to bring a big conflict into the end. And they really didn't have grand strategies, but they improvised. And I think we can learn something from them, how to engage adversaries in deep conflicts like this. Now, this year, 2014 marks the 25th anniversary. It is hard for me to believe, and some of you who lived through the Cold War, well, it's been 25 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall. In fact, in a couple of weeks, we will be celebrating, commemorating, thinking about the fall of the Berlin Wall, and none other than the people of Berlin will be celebrating this. However, this joyous occasion that was supposed to be has been marred, or in a sense perhaps eclipsed, by the recent events in Crimea, by the recent events in Ukraine. And they evoke some fears, they evoke some concerns among Europeans, Eastern Europeans, and European Union as a whole. So we have to ask, is Vladimir Putin, is his aim to reignite the Cold War? Well, I don't think so. I say no. Are Putin's actions being misperceived by the United States and Europe? Most likely, yes. I'm leaning towards that kind of an explanation. So, as a historian of the Cold War, Russia, Eastern Europe, this very kind of a troubled region, I would like to offer you about 3 major themes, or 3 major things to think about as I think about Putin's actions, recent actions, and also some things that perhaps shed some light on how to explain the challenges and the difficulties of this region. So my first theme, or my first explanation is that Mr. Putin, or President Putin, is flexing his military muscle, and that demonstrates his fear. I still believe it is his fear of encirclement by the West, and also of Western influence, such as spread of democracy. This theme is not new. This theme has been recurring in Russian and Soviet history, and most notably among the leadership, not so much the people. The fear of the West and ideas coming of the West and its influence was particularly present soon after the end of World War II among the Soviet leadership, and it really continued to permeate throughout the Cold War and perhaps even until Gorbachev. Therefore, I believe that Putin's actions, as aggressive as they may seem, should be understood within the larger context of Russia's concern for Western encroachment into its own sphere of influence, that is Ukraine, and also the possibility of the presence of democratic institutions in Ukraine that could perhaps trickle to Russia through organizations not so much like NATO, but the European Union. The second theme I would like to share with you here is that Putin's actions can perhaps also be understood within the context of Russia's ongoing search for its identity, its place in the world, and its really place in world affairs. We need to remember, and those of you who are in my Russia class, those of you who have taken my world history classes, those of you who have taken Cold War perhaps, or will be taking at some point, that it was not until the 18th century, the early 18th century, that the Russian czars, especially the Romanovs, under the mantle of Peter the Great, and I'm sure that most of you have heard of Peter the Great, began somewhat, and that's our keyword, to embrace Western ideas and modernize Russia to some extent. Up until that point, however, up until the early 18th century, the Russian czars were deeply traditional, they were inward-looking, and they were deeply religious. However, the Romanovs, who no doubt created or formed a very impressive empire. When you really look at Russia, I mean, it is a very impressive empire, at least geographically. They did not manage to create one that was on the par with other European powers, with Britain, with France, for example. With the Russian Revolution, this is my view, that the Russian identity became a Soviet communist identity that permeated through the lives, obviously, of the people and the leadership, and a country that was really to be reckoned with all throughout the time of the Cold War. That type of identity, however, and I argue, was shattered. It was really shattered with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. So the Cold War ended in 1989, but the Soviet Union lasted for about 2 more years. But that identity, that Soviet communist identity, really was shattered with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, and the collapse of the communist system, and also the loss of prestige. It was loss of the prestige of the Soviet Union around the world. Now, what Putin seems to be doing, to me, via all of the actions that we have seen him do recently, is to reclaim that status. He's trying to reclaim the status of a power that commands respect around the world and around other nations. He is doing this, however, with hard power, with flexing his military muscle. He is not doing this with using what we refer to as soft power, through exports of Russian culture, music, literature, and many great things that Russia actually has to offer, but he is really resorting to using and relying on things like oil and gas reserves and combining that with military pressure. My final theme to leave you guys with is that I believe that recent events in the annexation of Crimea by Russia that really instigated the Ukrainian crisis show us a lot of the dilemmas and challenges that the former Soviet bloc nations have had and are still dealing with, and the dilemmas of policies toward Russia. As some of you may be aware, the region of what used to be the former Soviet bloc was called Eastern Europe, or former Eastern Europe, and now it is called East Central Europe. But that region has had a deeply turbulent, deeply tragic history starting all throughout the 20th century, starting in World War I, all throughout World War II, and really all throughout pretty much till the early 1990s, with the imposition of communism and the status of these nations as pretty much just sovereign, but really semi-sovereign nations that were deeply controlled by the policies of Moscow. Now, all of these countries now that you see here are part of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and they're part of the European Union. The two international organizations, the EU and NATO, no doubt provided and have provided and continue to provide stability and, in a sense, prosperity to this region, prosperity that the region has not really enjoyed for a long time in the 20th century. Interestingly, that crisis in Crimea that instigated the Crimean accession, that instigated a Ukrainian crisis, initially evoked a lot of fear from these countries that perhaps Putin is trying to be aggressive, perhaps he's trying to go on some larger kind of a scheme of maybe reconstituting the sphere of influence. However, the recent research that I have done shows that many of the countries, Poland included, Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, and others are actually rethinking their policies toward Russia. They're rethinking their foreign policies. So within the context of being part of NATO, within the context of being part of the EU, they are beginning to realize that they have also their own interests with Russia, and those interests are also economic. And if those interests are not taken care of, well, it can hurt a lot of the economies of the nations at hand. Now, So what to do? What to do about Russia? How to understand it? How to understand their actions, and especially Putin's actions? So as a historian, I could not help myself, but I'm going to bring in a primary document with me. And I would like to share with you some of the words that I really believe have some merit. And those are the words from a renowned U.S. official, Mr. George Kennan, who is the one who coined the phrase of containment. And he's in his very now famous long telegram. The words that I'm going to read to you are from February of 1946, so a long time ago. So a long time ago, in the midst of the origins of the Cold War. And this is what Mr. Kennan had to say, and I quote, "Russian people are, by and large, friendly to outside world, eager for experience of it, eager to measure against its talents they are conscious of possessing, eager above all to live in peace and enjoy fruits of their own labor. We, as Americans, must see that our public is educated to the realities of Russian situation. I cannot overemphasize the importance of this. Press cannot do this alone. It must be done mainly by government, which is necessarily more experienced and better informed on practical problems involved." So this is the cry out to the policymakers. "I am convinced that there would be far less hysterical anti-Sovietism in our country today if realities of their situation were better understood by our people. And there's nothing as dangerous or as terrifying as the unknown." Thank you, and I welcome you to ask questions following our presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Dr. Dada.
Thank you. I think it's really fitting that Margaret, Dr. Nowinska, finished with some discussion of containment, because that's where I'm going to start, looking at things from the U.S. perspective. And for as dangerous as the Cold War was seen to be, it made life in a great power foreign policy sense fairly simple for the United States. And the United States, I think correctly at the time, and really in concert with or going along with traditional international relations theory, adopted this policy of containment. Right? We had this idea that the United States was going to try to stop Russian communism or Soviet communism from expanding. The United States, for fear of nuclear war, decided that it was going to try and contain communism. It wasn't going to try to directly attack it, and therefore we didn't see, or it was not in anyone's best interest to see a direct conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. For that reason, we saw proxy wars, and we saw the creation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, as Dr. Nowinska talked about. And the NATO alliance, from the U.S. perspective, was primarily and almost completely tasked with deterring Soviet aggression, right? And really even putting a buffer zone between the United States and any Soviet influence. And that'll come back later, right? This question, the Soviet Union collapses. President Ronald Reagan and some of his followers, some of his top advisors would like to claim victory. They oftentimes say, well, it was the rearmament in the 80s, right? We had détente, which happened starting with Nixon, but the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan ended détente, and the Cold War started again. And that really became an economic war, right? It was no longer a war of ideology. It was really about who could last longer, and capitalism could far outlast communism. In my opinion, Reagan probably can't claim victory. He probably didn't cause the end of the Cold War. He may have brought it around a few years sooner. But the difficult thing with this situation and this history is that while the Soviet Union was a threat, it created a lot of stability. It made foreign policy really pretty easy. And it made the U.S. role in foreign policy very clear, right? The Soviets were the major threat. Well, the Soviet Union collapsed. It's still right? Its remnants are still there, but the question really becomes, well, what is next? And we see in the 1990s really two visions from George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton that have different visions for a post-Cold War order, right? On one hand, there's this idea, right, and both of them share this in their own way in both of their policies, that history was over, right? And there's a famous article that's oft quoted and misquoted saying that democratic Western capitalism had won the day, and that was the end of history. I think that's one dead wrong, as we've seen empirically. But what does the United States do? Right? There were two competing schools. On one hand, there was this idea that the United States should return to isolationism, and it was really this clear lack of world annihilation, really this lack of a threat that was so massive as the Soviet Union would really lead to U.S. declinism. The United States had no reason and really no interest in being as important of a country as it had been for the second half of the 20th century. There was also an internationalist vision, right? And this was the vision largely that was accepted and that was taken, right? There was this assertion that the United States was going to lead from the top. It was going to become an international player, or it was an international player, but it was going to expand. And it was no longer bounded by this policy of containment, this fear that the Soviet Union direct expansion was a security threat. And so with no major threats, perhaps the United States could focus on domestic issues. It could focus on economics. We see in the 1990s an amazing growth of free trade and interdependence among countries, in economic integration, and we also see an economic boom in the 1990s in the U.S., which really draws people away from this idea, and politics certainly away from this idea of isolationism and declinism, right? The idea is engagement is better, and engagement is really going to help everyone, or at least that was the U.S.'s approach, right? The U.S. would be leading from the top and from the front, and that other countries around the world would be increasingly integrated into that order, Russia included, although perhaps not right away. Additionally, you see things like borderless threats, right? Terrorism, environmental concerns, really start to become political issues, and they become international political issues, whereas before the Soviet Union dominated, right? Containment dominated. But at the same time, we see, well, NATO still exists today, right? NATO was created to contain the Soviet Union or to counter a Soviet threat. And so traditional realists might suggest that the United States is making itself weaker by having NATO still exist, by still participating in NATO. And I think a better explanation of what NATO does and why it still exists is that alliances are not really simply about capability aggregation. It's not about integrating your army and your military into ours to make it bigger or to provide a buffer zone geopolitically. It's about expanding influence, and the United States is extending its security umbrella in order to be able to extend its influence economically and politically. And interestingly, we're starting to see, one, we saw a peaceful disintegration of the Soviet Union. That was something that George Bush, the older George Bush, oversaw. And there's this expansion of NATO, right? We start to see NATO expanding. We have the end of the Cold War. And NATO, which was primarily a North American and Western European institution, with perhaps the exception of Turkey and Greece, starts to expand, right? In 1990, you see East Germany unify with West Germany to create Germany. We have the expansion in 1999, countries that to a large extent did not benefit from the Soviet system, starting to applying to be part of NATO really right after the collapse of the Soviet Union and then ultimately being integrated. Then we see the Baltic states in 2004, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, and Slovakia, and most recently Croatia and Albania. And the expansion of the European Union has happened perhaps a little more slowly and perhaps with a little more scrutiny of some of these countries. And what I think we're starting to see here is Russia, as Dr. Nowinska mentioned, is starting to see some encroachment, right? NATO and Western influence, especially military security influence, is starting to really come close to the borders of the former Soviet Union, right? It's well into the Soviet bloc at this point, but the former Soviet Union itself and those republics. So from the American perspective, this is happening because the Americans largely think, well, we won. An integration of the former Soviet Union, and perhaps even ultimately Russia, is something that's perhaps a foregone conclusion, but something that's going to happen perhaps slowly over time. I think Dr. Slobodchikoff is going to tell you that there's a considerably different narrative in Russia. And so my last point that I'll bring up is looking at the present. In other words, why do we see this happening now, given that it's been perhaps brewing or was even seen as dormant for 20-some years, and 25 years later it's starting to potentially rear its head? Well, one thing that's happened is the United States has had to show its geopolitical hand and its military hand, so to speak. You have currently a war-weary public in the United States and clear demonstrations of the limit of the use of its military force and generally a lack of resolve to intervene, especially after spending the better part of a decade and a half in conflict. One of the early ideas that came out of the post-Cold War order was probably best characterized by George H.W. Bush when he spoke at West Point, that really the use of force going forward, the use of military force was going to be limited. And limited force, I quote, where the potential benefits justify the sacrifice. In other words, that the use of force was now a political issue that had to be sold to the U.S. public. It had to be justifiable on a case-by-case basis. It wasn't this idea that the Soviet Union is there, it's going to be there, and we're going to have to deal with it. And I think you can really see now, right, why things are happening now through the idea of international relations as a bargaining process. The United States, in engaging in Iraq while losing some public support. One of the things about democracies is democracies are very good at making threats in some cases. And democratic institutions very much hamstring democratic leaders in other situations, because you have public opinion, and public opinion is transparent and it matters. So the United States has clearly demonstrated to a potential rival or another emerging power that it lacks the resolve and perhaps the capabilities, perhaps the military capabilities to intervene, right? In other words, to use its military to stop this. And I think this is backed up by the approach of using such institutions like economic sanctions, and really very limited, very targeted economic sanctions that don't have a great deal of teeth. That demonstrates that there is really limited resolve, and perhaps intervention in the Ukraine is not something that the United States public is politically willing to support. And so while we see this happening, there are a couple buttressing factors. You see the international leadership in the West is fragmented. We see traditional allies like Germany and France not supporting U.S. foreign policy, at least not carte blanche, in the invasion of Iraq. So perhaps, right, there's some weakness in NATO. We also see problems in Europe, right? Economic problems, fragmentation with bailouts, and what are seen as really domestic issues in a European perspective. And really limited national interests in the Ukraine. It's not clear what it is that the United States gets out of some kind of intervention. And so I think that's why you see this happening now, on top of perhaps some domestic issues in Ukraine that Michael will talk about in a minute. But we're starting to see NATO and the EU approaching the borders of the former Soviet Union. I think Michael will talk about a Putin doctrine, which largely shows that as the line not to cross. I won't steal his thunder. But to answer this question, are we reigniting the Cold War? Is Putin reigniting the Cold War? I don't think so. I think to compare anything you're going to see today to the Cold War is incorrect. I think you're starting to see a rivalry, right, or the rekindling of a rivalry and of tension, but not the Cold War. Not a Cold War. Not a situation where you have two more equal powers that are in a standoff or a stalemate with massive international implications.
No, we're fine.
Okay, I'm finished.
Oh, okay. Oh,
I
thank
think.
you. Slobodchikoff.
Well, I feel very blessed to be working with such colleagues at Troy University that are able to share their insights and help us all understand what's going on. In fact, Troy is really ahead of the curve at looking at this issue. In fact, Harvard University is only putting together their panel tomorrow. So we're really ahead of the game here. So if I can have the clicker, please.
Sorry.
That's okay. And I really want to get at, to go from the American perspective and NATO expansion that Dr. Todd Hunter was just talking about, and the context of the Cold War that Dr. Gnowinska was talking about, and to look at what the Russian response really has been and what the Russians have been thinking about this, because we tend to focus on a Western perspective here and not think about what the Russians feel at all. And I would like to start off actually in 1998 with George Kennan again. And he was asked in an interview what he thought about NATO expansion and what would happen. And George Kennan said, Russia will view it as a threat. We are starting a new Cold War. And this was really the impetus for this discussion. As Dr. Todd Hunter and Dr. Gnowinska have talked about, are we entering a new Cold War? Well, we can debate that. But George Kennan certainly thought that our actions would be interpreted by the Russians as a threat to their national security and that they would respond in kind. So here we are with a map of Europe, and as we saw NATO expansion, we see NATO getting closer and closer to Russia, but not only Russia and Eastern Europe, but also starting to go into the former Soviet Union. And rightly or wrongly, Russia has always felt that it has influence in these territories and has the right to use these territories as buffer zones from Western influence. And so it sees these states as vital to their national security interests. And so even as early as the early 90s, when NATO was talking about expanding, then President Yeltsin was telling the American president, don't expand. Don't expand. We consider it a threat. Well, NATO kept expanding. And again, as each new round of expansion, again the Russians would say, don't expand further. And honestly, they didn't have the power to stop the U.S. from expanding. And so the U.S. kept expanding. And so this was seen as a threat to their national security interests. And finally, Russia said, we'll draw a line in the sand. And that line in the sand is do not expand into the territories of the former Soviet Union, either for the EU or for NATO. I think that this fear of Western encroachment that Dr. Gnowinska talked about is extremely important. There was a meeting between Putin and Bush many years ago, and Bush was joking with Putin in front of the cameras, and he said, you know, we really need more democracy in Russia. You guys don't know how to do it. And Putin responded back, if what you mean by democracy is what you've set up in Iraq, we want nothing to do with it. And so I think that this fear of Western encroachment and this idea that the West knows how to run things the best has always bothered the Russians. They feel that they have a civilization that has been around for millennia and one that has the right to choose its own form of government and the way it should run things. Again, though, the Russians have been under the Tatar yoke for over 300 years. Russia is located between East and West, between Asia and Europe, and has constantly had this identity. What are they? Are they more European? Are they more Asian? What are they? They're unique. And so this search for a national identity really is a large part of this, because they're not like the Americans. And they keep telling the Americans, we're not like you. Okay? We may be similar. We may have many similar ideas, but we are not you. We have a different perspective on history and on events. Another theme that I would like to really talk about in terms of the 25th anniversary of the end of the Cold War is that we tend to look on events through the lenses of the Cold War. We tend to examine things, even the way we've talked about things in this panel. Are we in a new Cold War? Well, Russia's not as much of a global power as it was when it was the Soviet Union. So already Dr. Todd Hunter says, well, wait a minute, this is more of a regional conflict between Russia and the United States. This isn't global superpowers facing off the way it was during the Cold War. And yet we talk about this as a new Cold War, and we talk about it reigniting. We look at NATO expansion through the eyes of the Cold War. We look at it in terms of security. How important is Poland to the security of the United States? How important is Poland to the security of Europe? Did we really need to expand NATO into those territories? How much of it was their fear of Russian influence which drove them to try and join NATO and to lobby the United States into accepting them in NATO? Again, through the perspective of the Cold War. And Russia has very much seen the actions of the United States in spreading and expanding NATO and spreading and expanding the EU through the eyes of the Cold War, and seen this as a direct threat to them, despite assurances by the United States that this has nothing to do with them. And so we look at these experiences through past experiences and through these lenses, and we're able to see these things and misperceive actions. And now we move to specifically to Ukraine. And I have highlighted Crimea here first, okay? Because what happened specifically to create this conflict? Well, in November of 2013, then President Yanukovych of Ukraine was set to sign an association agreement with the EU. And this worried Russia tremendously, because part of what the EU was urging was to begin to distance Ukraine from Russia economically, but even more fundamentally, to begin to ensure that Russia would not have as much military control over the Crimean Peninsula. And the Crimean Peninsula here is the home of the only warm water port for the Russian Navy. It is of extreme strategic importance to Russian interests. So Russia came to Yanukovych and offered him a good deal. They offered him economic support, they offered him grants, they offered him much cheaper gas if he would walk away from the association agreement. And he said, okay. He said, we'll walk away. Well, many people in Western Ukraine were not happy by this. And they began protesting in Kiev, especially in the central Maidan Square. And they began protesting this, they began protesting corruption and demanding that Yanukovych sign the association agreement with the EU. And what they saw was they saw Russia's creeping influence into Ukraine again and wanted to distance themselves from that. And they said that the best way to distance themselves from Russian influence is to sign this association agreement with the EU and eventually try to join the EU and NATO. And this was a way to move away from Russian influence. In 2013, in December, protesters occupied the city hall and the Maidan Square. There were over 800,000 people who attended the demonstration. Again, Putin offered $15 billion to alleviate Ukrainian debt and to reduce the price of gas to Ukraine by 1/3. In January of 2014, the Ukrainian parliament passed restrictive anti-protest laws, and the protesters began storming government offices in Western Ukraine. The prime minister at the time resigned, and then the parliament annulled the anti-protest laws. Amnesty was offered to protesters if they would just leave the government buildings. However, the opposition rejected those conditions. And in February of 2014, clashes erupted in Kiev. There were 18 dead, of which 7 were police officers. 25,000 police officers are encircled on Maidan Square. On the 20th of February, 88 people are killed. Many are killed by snipers. It is still argued about who was actually responsible for those sniper attacks. On the 21st of February, amid pressure from the United States, the European Union, and Russia, President Yanukovych signs a compromise deal with opposition leaders, which was supported by Russia, the US, and the EU, in which he agreed to call for new elections, and of which he would likely have lost. On the 22nd of February, one day later, Yanukovych disappeared, only to show up in Russia. The protesters took control of the presidential administration buildings, yet Parliament fails to impeach Yanukovych and doesn't get rid of him legally. Instead, they vote that he abandoned his office and reneged on the presidency. So it sets new elections for the 25th of May. An interim president is named, and Yatsenyuk was nominated prime minister. The police, the Birkut, was disbanded. Then, on the 27th and 28th of February, pro-Russian gunmen seized key buildings in Crimea. So what happened in Kiev was a new government took control. The new government was very anti-Russian. And the new government basically told Russia that the Black Sea Fleet would no longer be able to be stationed in Crimea. This worried Putin for his strategic interests. So he sent special forces into Crimea to take control of the area, never sent more forces than he was allowed to by treaty with Ukraine, but basically took over the territory. Crimea then declared a referendum, and it had two options. One was that it could secede from Ukraine and join Russia. The second option was that it could return to an earlier constitution under Ukraine where Crimea had more autonomy. Those were the only two options. There's a third option that should have been on the ballot, and that was to retain the status quo. That option was not on the ballot. The Russians hailed the referendum results as a clear victory and very quickly assimilated Crimea, thus ensuring that it would still have access to the port at Sevastopol in Crimea. It's right over here. Okay. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought here. So the Russians hailed the victory. The West said that the referendum was illegal and illegitimate and didn't recognize the results. On the 16th of March, the secession referendum was held, and 97% of the voters voted to join Russia. On April 7th, protesters began occupying buildings in Donetsk, Lugansk, and Kharkov, demanding a referendum on independence. This is the general area. Kharkov is up here, okay? So basically, eastern Ukraine. Okay. On the 15th of April, the interim president announced an anti-terrorist operation against pro-Russian separatists. And so we saw civil war break out in this area. Okay. And we can see this map has recent clashes, okay, mostly centered around eastern Ukraine, with a significant clash where pro-Russian protesters were burned in Odessa in a building. Okay? So those are the events of the conflict in Ukraine. Now, again, as we look at this conflict, which is basically a conflict between two powers, Russia and Ukraine, okay, a regional conflict, we analyze it through the eyes, again, of the Cold War, and we begin to look at it as geostrategically important for U.S. interests. Okay. And now I want to basically open it up to the panel and say, and ask what you think the future of this crisis means for American-Russian relations, or for the world at large, and what kind of, what we can interpret from these events.
Okay, I think my opinion is really that the implication for American-Russian relations is that you're going to see perhaps a lower level stalemate of tension going forward. I think Michael did a pretty good job of explaining that the sort of context through which it's easy to see this. I think the other context we could look at this is maybe the United States through its prestige in the world. And I think the one thing that is particularly troubling to the United States, especially given this role that it's assumed in the post-Cold War era, is that the United States can somehow engineer peace, right? It can get involved in engineer peace. And we've seen a couple examples in the last 15 years or so of that not really being something that the United States is able to do. And so this is perhaps an embarrassment to the United States. I think the easiest way that the Western powers could neutralize this or to deal with this would be to strengthen Europe, which also is perhaps an embarrassment to the United States. So I think you're likely to see increased tension, but perhaps not tension with major implications for the U.S. other than perhaps that it is demonstrated that it is more limited than it would like to be internationally.
Well, I'm glad to see that we all kind of agree, right? So the U.S. Russian relations, I do agree with you that it's all about, and going back to the idea of misperceptions, that, as I mentioned earlier, and all of us seem to agree on this, is that the actions that you have seen from Mr. Putin are more, less aggressive than they seem, and they're a lot more regional than should be understood within the global context. What I would like to bring in is also the local perspective of smaller nations and also the former Soviet bloc nations, because as I mentioned initially, to them, annexation of Crimea seemed extremely aggressive in the beginning of the crisis, but as we see, as things are kind of winding down, the new countries the relatively new countries in NATO and in the EU, Poland, Hungary, and others included, are beginning to see this crisis again as more regional, as more kind of localized. And what you see is kind of the step back on especially the Poland side, Hungarian side, that they're not as interested perhaps anymore in bringing Ukraine into the EU and into NATO as they have been. And of course it has to do with, with domestic politics, but you see this kind of shift within their foreign policies, as I mentioned earlier, that they're seeing that there's a reality of Russia, they have their own geostrategic interests, the conflict is localized and regional, and perhaps it is not something that, that concerns them as directly. So as far as U.S.-Russian relations, I would say that, that it should be really seen as more of a regional conflict than something that could perhaps blow up. But I do agree that we still view Russia's actions from in the Cold War perspective, because Russia from 1945 all the way to 1989 or 1991 was perceived as the nemesis, and whatever Russia does seems to be aggressive. So,
one of the difficulties in the early stages of any conflict, especially fights between states, but I think it's true between individuals as well, is the identification of clear lines between who the adversaries really are. And listening to your three presentations, one of the things that struck me here is each of you sort of took a different perspective as to who the adversaries are in this fight. We started out with Dr. Nowinska and her history and context of the Cold War, which was clearly a bipolar battle over a half century between the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies. And that lingers with us.
Yes.
That generation is still around, and everyone in this room at some level is a Cold Warrior and remembers that period. Dr. Todd Hunter talked in terms of U.S. interest, presidential administrations, two Bushes, particularly, and in Clinton and Reagan. And U.S. could potentially be embarrassed by this if it goes the wrong way. And we have a president right now who's very vulnerable, particularly with respect to foreign policy. If he does even the slightest minor thing, he's going to get bashed for it, especially in an election year, as we know. Dr. Slobodchikoff, on the other hand, is talking about the vulnerabilities for Russia. It seems to me Putin has some real vulnerabilities here. The foundation of his political leadership inside of Russia is his clear identification, and he's a very popular guy, as we well know, inside of Russia. The foundation of that popularity is his clear identification and his ability to prey upon Russian nationalism and a resurgence of Russian nationalism. The taking of important military assets in the Crimea, probably the most important military base belonging to Russia, if that were to be taken out and seemingly moving in a European direction, he loses a lot of his base. So he had to act. If he had not acted, he's in a very almost position of jeopardy. So my question is this a conflict? And I'll address it to all three of you because all of you talked about it. Is this a conflict between the United States and Russia? Is this a conflict between Europe and Russia? Or is this a conflict between Ukraine and Russia? Because the last few comments by Dr. Slobodchikoff were about internal dimensions, the Ukrainian leadership and the people to the West in particular who want to associate themselves far more with those to the West than they do to the Russians. The divide here kind of is on this map, it seems to me. But I'd like to hear comments from all three of you on that.
If I can begin, I would say the answer to your questions are yes to all three. And I think that this crisis has really evolved in the players. It started out as a very regional crisis and has developed into more of a conflict between the EU and the US on one side and Russia on the other through sanctions, etc. So I think originally it was a very regional conflict that has now blown up to have global security implications, rightly or wrongly, for all the players involved.
Which is sort of like the early stages of the Cold War that you talked about, Margaret, with respect to misperceptions of real actions. I didn't mean to interrupt, but
yeah, that's all right.
just
You mean global players? Who do you refer to?
The three main players, US, EU, and Russia.
And not Ukraine. So we do not consider
you don't see a
Ukraine.
Ukrainian-Russian conflict.
Oh, absolutely. There's a Ukrainian-Russian conflict here, and that's at the heart of the situation. But as the conflict has evolved, it's evolved into creating this conflict between the larger powers. What started out as a very regional and smaller conflict, not to diminish Ukraine in any respect, but starting out as a very regional, bilateral conflict between the two states has now expanded into a conflict between the global players.
Well, I think I would have to respectfully disagree.
Please do.
Because I believe that it did begin as a regional conflict, and I think it kind of, so disagree and agree, how about that? That it did begin as a regional conflict, was very localized, was, you can argue, between Russia and Ukraine, and it did escalate. And it did escalate, and all the other players that we're talking about kind of got pulled in. But what I'm seeing right now, at least from the former Eastern European countries and also from other older NATO members and the EU members, and even from the United States, and again, that's not as strong of a point of mine, but it is de-escalating. I think it is de-escalating. Or they're trying to de-escalate.
They're trying to de-escalate.
Because I think they're beginning to see that it really is between Russia and Ukraine. And it's also something fascinating that you and I have been talking about in the past. It's also challenging Ukrainian identity. It's also because we have been talking about Russia's identity. We've been talking about how, we misperceive them, but why do we forget about Ukraine? I mean, we don't really forget about them. We don't emphasize as much, but they are a player. They're one of the major players. They're not the player, but they're one of the major players. They have a lot at stake, and something that you did not bring up, we don't have a map of different ethnicities in Ukraine, which is really fascinating because there are a lot of people you see in the eastern part of Ukraine. They're actually of Russian descent. I mean, they're ethnically Russian. So you have a lot of mixed marriages. And some people are really kind of, their identities are being very challenged because they're not really sure who they should support anymore. If you have a mother of Ukrainian descent, you've got a father of Russian descent, and who do you support? So it also challenged the Ukrainian identity. So I do see it as a regional, localized conflict that did blow up, and it created quite a bit of fear, quite a bit of concern, but I'm beginning to see it to de-escalate.
But it's not over yet.
It's not over yet, but I'm beginning to see this. So call me an optimist.
After the elections are held, we'll see what happens.
But judging from the foreign policies of, again, the former Eastern European countries, the newer nations of NATO, of the EU, who would have most at stake, they are not taking on those more of the hawkish kind of policies that you would expect them to. Why would you expect them? Because they were part of the former sphere of Soviet influence. So that's my take on that.
Let's take the last few minutes here, if we would, and open this up to you. I think we've given everyone here a great deal of food for thought,
yes.
But I'm sure there are some people in the audience that have some very good questions, and I would invite you to come up. If you would, just come up to this microphone and ask the question.
It seems to me that part of what's going on in Ukraine is along the lines of a civil war that relates back to how the Soviet Union and Ukraine were one entity during the 1930s. Because in the western part of Ukraine, there were 1 million Ukrainians who died of starvation as a result of collectivization, and they still remember that, and they're still angry about that. When I was in Crimea before, one of the hats that somebody gave me had on it, Ukraine, free Ukraine forever. And when I was in Sevastopol, in the ex-Soviet secret submarine base, I could see how that is an essential part of the thing that Russia has traditionally wanted, a warm report. So I don't think it's going to be easy between the two of them to get out of that. But I'm wondering if the international community doesn't mind Russia taking over Crimea, would that be analogous to the United States deciding that we just as soon take over Cuba and end that little issue? Because to me, it's kind of the same situation. It's just a situation that's been simmering in the Cold War context for all that time.
Wow.
Who do you want to answer that?
I'll take a stab at that and say no, simply because I don't know that the U.S. taking over Cuba is of any real strategic importance to the United States. We have Florida and the Eastern Seaboard. We don't necessarily need that from a geostrategic perspective. But no, I'll say that yeah, there are minimal marginal returns for the U.S. I think this is much more strategic, at least in Russia's eyes, than that would be for the U.S.
You want to go first?
I just think so. I'm just interested, that revolution took place in Kiev, and it wasn't western part, sorry, it was like north part, so it's not only about western part. So don't you think that Putin was afraid that people in Russia will raise against him, against his rule? Yeah, like maybe it was the reason why he began to involve into Ukraine, Crimea, so...
Yes, I do agree, and it goes back to my earlier comments of this fear of either Western encirclement, of Western institutions, democratic institutions that are brought in not just by NATO but by the European Union. So what, in my view, he is concerned, or if you want to say fearful or afraid of, that trickle, not down, but a trickle up effect to Russia as well.
Yeah,
so I agree.
Question about Crimea. So he didn't agree, Putin, I mean, that it was his soldiers in Crimea. He told that it was something. So Ukrainian government, they could say that it's terrorists, we can do something against them. So why? If it's okay in international relations, because he lied. literally. And is it okay?
Michael, do you want to answer that one?
Is it okay to
Yeah.
annex another part of another country? Is that what you're asking?
I mean, he lied. And then
Is it okay to lie?
He said that.
Is it okay to lie in international relations?
Yes, it is.
Absolutely.
If it wasn't okay to lie, we wouldn't have any leaders left.
Exactly.
It was about another country, not about Russia. It was about Crimea, Ukraine. So he couldn't do this.
If I could for a second step back,
Yes.
I know my two colleagues agreed with you when you said that at the heart of it, it's Putin's fear of democracy and him being taken out. I would say that while that does factor in, I would say that wasn't his main motivator for going into Crimea. Again, I think this was security over the Black Sea Fleet. I think that as this conflict has evolved, though, I think we have seen this fear and Putin can't stand down. He can't relinquish Crimea, because if he does, he will lose all credibility with the Russian people, and more importantly, with the political elites and those who could overthrow him conceivably, especially the remnants of the KGB or the Siloviki, what we call Siloviki. So I think that, but going back to your second question about Putin lying, the events surrounding the takeover of Crimea were a very quick special forces action, and had he admitted Russian involvement in the early stages before the referendum, he wouldn't have been successful in doing it. So it was strategically important for him to lie.
I think to add to that, it introduces a certain amount of plausible deniability for the international community. I think I'd agree, at least in part, that his actions were largely they're security related, but they're also related to Putin's own political security and longevity. And by introducing a certain level of plausible deniability or covert action, he limited the extent to which the international community or the West could condemn. It's already their mechanisms that they have for intervention are already slow. Perhaps he could slow that down a little more.
Jim, do you have a question?
In an abstract way, this last answer kind of came or started to approach some of the issues that I'm thinking about. I've got a lot of them. I'll only address a couple. The first one, considering the de-democratization of Russia by Putin and his, whether it's perceived otherwise or not, aggressive actions with regard to the Ukraine, but also internally, it brings to mind a historical view of early mid-20th century Europe, and another nationalist leader who only wanted a little bit of appeasement. And the other aspect, I will bring in the international relations piece, is the very realistic approach that Russia is taking to its environment versus the much more liberal view that the United States, who has been pretty much trashed recently for their aggressiveness internationally, toward this situation. We've mostly approached it with an economic, non-military view, and it seems like we are trying to remain away or keep away from military actions. So in this sense, it almost seems as if we're in a position where realism works as long as liberalism isn't willing to go to war. Comments, thoughts?
Shall we ask ask what leader he had in mind.
He's talking about Hitler.
I know.
Yeah, I think you raise an interesting point, and geopolitically, I think there are some definite parallels present, not the least of which is the lack of political support for military action, but also perhaps conflict is a bargaining process, and you learn about adversaries as conflict unfolds, and so perhaps even greater, and perhaps if Putin were to have such interests, perhaps of potentially really of greater, a bigger problem, is the military option really there? If Putin were to expand outwardly, does the United States, does Europe have the ability to counter that threat? And I think the answer is yes, but not without paying some severe costs. And I think you really see from a foreign policy perspective, the West is not willing to go there. I think the West largely hopes that Putin is happy the way that he is. I think Putin is driven perhaps a little more by domestic considerations and his domestic political longevity, and not some ideology like Hitler was. So that might be the difference. But I think the parallels that you draw are probably right. They're at least partially accurate, and I think they are problematic.
Well, I don't think I do agree with you when you talk about the parallels between Hitler and between Putin, because what you can tell is, and what I'm kind of going back to your earlier comment, and I'm sorry, your name, the lady who talked about Crimea being given back by Khrushchev. I mean, what really complicates, and you're comparing Cuba to Crimea. I mean, again, as a historian, I mean, we get very, very nervous sometimes about a lot of analogies. Because there's so many different factors at hand, but what complicates the Crimean case, and you said has already been traditionally Russian. Well, technically since 1783, when Catherine the Great moved in and annexed Crimea and was part of Russia, but in 1954, when you were mentioning Khrushchev, when he allegedly gave back that region to Ukraine. Why did he do this? Well, he did this also for, speaking of leaders, domestic reasons or their own reasons to do that. Well, it's to help him with de-Stalinization process. I mean, this was only a year after Stalin died, 1953, and Khrushchev was trying to become a leader of the Soviet Union through the power struggle. So in 1954, he is, quote unquote, giving Crimea back to Ukraine. But what really complicates the issue, and something that we have not really addressed here, maybe we should, is the issue of the Budapest Agreement in 1994. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but there was an agreement, and it's a very disputed agreement, that following the fall of the Soviet Union, and keep in mind, Ukraine had incredible amount of nuclear weapons. If any of you remember Chernobyl, the explosion of the nuclear plant happened in Ukraine. So what you have is an agreement in 1994 where you have Ukraine willing to give up nuclear weapons for its for respect for its sovereignty. But it was never really signed. It was never really discussed. It was never so. So what really complicates, just going back to your question, what really complicates the Crimea issue? I mean, the statistics I look up, and you can help me here, was 75% Russians living there at the time of annexation.
And in the Crimea?
Yeah, in very recently,
close
right?
To 80,
right.
Yeah.
So in Putin's mind, I mean, it is territorially a Russian part, and as what you're saying, I mean, it was within this one piece of the Soviet Union, but there was never really anything signed that was given to Ukraine. That's what complicates things in international relations and international treaties, that in Putin's mind, this is part of Russia. So this is my 2 cents here.
And that's the last word.